So my goal with this video is to kind of get into some charts that are going to show um, exactly why people are feeling the way they're feeling right now. Why are we dealing with the wealth inequality? Why is that a problem? Why is the debt so high? And how are all these things related? So the first thing I want to show is the US debt. So let's just do that. Different charts allow different things to happen. But what is important about this chart? What you're going to see is this chart begins in 1940, right? Midst of World War II. And we accrued relative to our gross domestic, so we're coming out of the Depression during this time. So whatever our GDP would have been at this point, debt to GDP would have been probably pretty low. But it significantly skyrockets during World War II, which is to be under, makes sense, right? This is going to continue until the end of World War II. And then you have the Bretton Woods Conference, which essentially establishes the US dollar as the world reserve currency during this time. So what's going to happen over the next 30 years? We have massive decreases in debt to GDP. We reduce it. This takes us up until the mid-1970s, and then let me do this here so we can really see it. So around 1980, it plateaus, and it's at the far right over here, you'll see when I'm hovered over the chart in this certain spot around 1980, 1981, it's at 31% of debt to GDP. So our relative to our gross domestic product, the debt is just 31%. We went from, in 1946 to that time, so more than 3 decades, it took us down that low. We decreased it. Now keep in mind, during this time, we funded Social Security, we went to the moon, the interstate highway system, Medicaid, Medicare, and all sorts of other programs were funded by the government. So we spent a lot during this time. But what happened during this time was we expanded the middle class. We had strong unions during most of this time, and there was a lot of spending that was happening. We were growing as an economy. There was a massive issue with inflation during the 70s. Primarily because we were spending on the Vietnam War. We got out of the gold standard because we decoupled the dollar during this time, where we were spending more than the gold reserves that we had. And so what happened is people started to realize we did not have enough gold to back up our currency. And because of that, Nixon made the announcement that we were decoupling. We were no longer going to honor every dollar with a certain amount of gold. So it became decoupled, and you have the oil price shocks that happened during this time. So lots of things going on. You ended up with a lot of inflation, and then we ended up with Ronald Reagan. Reagan and the big push for trickle-down economics cut taxes during this time, and drastically cut taxes. During this period of time, we see the debt to GDP start to rise. This is Reagan and Bush's presidency right here. A shift did happen during Reagan, because in Britain you had Margaret Thatcher. You had a lot of things happening at the same time. And really what that was getting away from high tax rates and really focusing more on a free economy type, less regulation type of economy, a free market type of an economy. But debt to GDP starts to rise here for several reasons. As far as GDP, it does keep rising. If I just purely look at the gross domestic product over time, what you'll see is just constant growth with a handful of pullbacks here and there. And our GDP right now is almost $30 trillion. The reason we have a problem right now is because our debt is high relative to that. So how high is it? It is as high as it was beyond actually what it was after World War II. But what I think is really telling about why inflation took off so much relative to where we are now, relative to where it was in the past, and why some people got rich and other people didn't, and why everybody's feeling left behind, is look at taxes. So before I show it to you, the tax brackets that you're going to see change. This is not telling us the whole story of taxes. So for example, let's say you're in the highest tax bracket at a certain income level. You don't pay that rate on that tax bracket for all of your income. Let's just say, I don't know what the numbers are right now off the top of my head, but let's just say you make $500,000 a year. You're loaded, right? And let's say the highest tax bracket for that is 40%. It's not that high, but let's say it was 40%. That doesn't mean you pay your entire $500,000 of income at a 40% tax rate, or so you're paying $200,000 in taxes. It doesn't mean that. Actually, what it means is everything, wherever that tax bracket starts to happen at, that 40%, let's say it happened at $400,000 and you hit the highest tax bracket, and that's 40%. From that $400,000 to $500,000 point, now you're paying 40% on that. That's your marginal tax rate. So that this is looking at a marginal tax rate, the highest marginal tax rate. That's really what this is looking at. What you see is, this goes way back in time. This is going back to 1913. So this is World War I happening around here. We had a very low highest tax rate. Very low, you don't even have, when did the income tax happen? Like 1913, I think. So there's not much tax being paid. And then we have a very high rate. Then you have the roaring 20s happen here, right? This is prior to the Depression, a very low tax rate. Then you have the Great Depression. And then after the Great Depression, you end up with a 91% tax bracket. There is a tax bracket up this high. And that stayed for a long time. In fact, during that entire time that we saw the debt to GDP drop and the economy boom, it was during this period right here where you end up with a tax bracket over 90% for a part of it, and then during the Kennedy years and after Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, you end up, and throughout the 70s, it was the highest at 70%. Then Reagan came, and a couple of big drops where the rates got dropped all the way down to 28%. Well, why do we see debt to GDP rise during the Reagan years? This is the big reason right here. Same as the roaring 20s, where we saw massive spending and speculation and craziness happen, but that led to the Wall Street crash in 1929, and then you see the Great Depression happen. We're now at that point where our debt to GDP is really, really high because we've lowered taxes so much. And this is allowed, and I use this analogy, I'm going to continue to use this analogy a lot. Think of a Monopoly game. A Monopoly game starts with everybody being equal, right? Everybody is at $1,500 when they start that game. Over time, the money accumulates to one player, and the rest of the players eventually end up with nothing. They end up going bankrupt. That is the problem that you have with this kind of a boom-bust cycle when you have essentially too much capitalism. Think of capitalism as driving money flow from the poor to the rich, right? That's what happens in a monopoly game. Everybody has the same amount of money, but the money flows to one player. It's like a drain. That rich player becomes the drain where all that money flows to. That is capitalism. That's what happens. It causes money, a direction for money flow. And that money flows to that wealthiest player eventually. Now, the wealthiest player might change. It might change to another player, but it flows towards the rich. And that's what, when we lowered taxes so much, That's what happens, right? It's flowing in that direction. It's always trying to flow in that direction. So when you raise taxes, what you're doing, and you start creating programs and things that drive money to the poorer people, and you start to expand the middle class, because the poorer people in an economy spend it as soon as they get it. It's called the velocity of money. They spend money as soon as they get it. They don't hold on to it like a rich person who gets money, because the rich person, there's only so many things they need in life, and once they have all those things, they just invest it to grow their own wealth. And when they invest it, it causes asset inflation. You start seeing issues where money is now flowing into the stock market, the bond market, real estate market, and these assets start to go up in value. So what that leads to is a problem where the people who don't have the money see everything else, all these assets, getting more expensive. And that leads to the problem where people feel like they're joining a monopoly game that's been going on for a while. And there's no way to get into the game because all the properties are already bought up. And the game is already going on. There's houses and hotels on everything. How do you join that game? Similarly, that's the way people nowadays, young people or people that did not inherit money, people who did not accumulate wealth in some way, they didn't have a house or whatever. They're just starting out and everything's already beyond expensive. Anyway, I'm going to stop this video here. I just wanted to hit some points. I'm going to do this kind of a format mostly today because it's raining. Because I like to walk and do a video at the same time. But this is, I think, a format I might try to play around with, where I just kind of take a few ideas for some charts and just get into some kind of a concept. But that's what I wanted to cover today. Thanks.